Hello everyone, my name is Carbon, and welcome back to the Outmaneuver YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be going over the top 5 tips for resourcing in Star Wars Unlimited. A couple of things before we get into the video. If you guys aren't subscribed already, please be sure to subscribe. Your support means the world to us, and it lets you stay up to date with our newest videos, newest content. And secondly, with the launch of Star Wars Unlimited last week, we've also launched the Outmaneuver Discord server. It's an awesome place to come chat with myself and the other members of the podcast directly, share your decks, talk strategy, etc. So the link is in the description for that. Please be sure to come say hey. And with that, let's get into the first tip. Coming in at number 5, we have staying flexible. Star Wars Unlimited is a very fluid, ever-changing game. With the back and forth action system, with the initiative system, everything on the board is changing, and that means that your resourcing needs to as well. You can't get tunnel vision on resourcing a specific card. You always need to be open to changing your resource plans in the middle of the game. A great example of this is Wing Leader, which is a great card, a great early card. A lot of players like to play an early Rebel unit on turn 1 and then follow it up with a Wing Leader to make a really huge unit. But sometimes it's going to be clear that that play is not going to work out. Either your opponent takes initiative and you know that their deck likely has a way to remove your card before it gets buffed. So you got to be careful and open to resourcing this card and not tunnel visioning on that 2-cost play into Wing Leader, maybe considering a different play where you maybe play a different 3-cost card. It'll have a different impact on the board, but lets you get yourself in a better advantage than if your unit was removed or stopped in some way. It's also important to resource based on the board state and also on your outs, right? If you get into a tight spot, you're going to need to, you're relying on drawing certain cards. You're just going to need to resource the cards that aren't doing anything and just play to your outs, play out to your best chance of winning the game. Even if that means resourcing a card that you've been holding onto for a while, a card that you really wanted to be able to play, etc. Our number 4 tip is weigh the risk. Resourcing in this game carries a lot of inherent risk. The chance you might throw away a card you're going to need later is a big deal. Let's talk about a couple of potential risks that come up when resourcing cards. So first off, is keeping duplicate cards a good idea? How risky is that? So when talking about like standard duplicate cards, for example, Open Fire, our removal card, if you have 2 of those, if it's clear that the board state and the situation will give you targets for both of those and give you chances to play both of those, then it's totally fine to keep 2 of the same card in your hand. However, you lose a bit of flexibility by doing this because there's another potential card that you could have had. The important thing here is to ensure that if you're keeping duplicate cards, you can get value out of both of those cards. This gets a little bit more interesting when we start talking about unique units and keeping duplicates of those, because you aren't able to have more than one of those on the board at any given time. And so you kind of have to look at the board state and evaluate, okay, is my unit going to stick around for a while? Or is it going to be removed? And then am I able to play the other copy of this unit? So Dooku is an example of a unit that is a really strong card. It comes down, removes a unit, but he has a shield and often sticks around for 1 to 2 turns. So if you have 2 Dookus in hand, there's a good chance you might not be able to play that second Dooku without defeating the Dooku you've already played, which is not ideal. Another big risk to look at is, should I resource my next turn play so I have more flexibility this turn? So this would be, an example of this would be if you're having to choose between resourcing, you've got 2 3-cost cards and a 4-cost card, right? And you're going to be you've got 3 resources this turn. You resource the 4-cost card, so you can keep 2 3-costs and have a choice between them. Or do you resource a 3-cost so you lock yourself into only one exact play for that turn, but you guarantee that you have a play for the following turn? This is a very interesting question. It depends a lot on what card it is. Going back to the example of Open Fire, or any removal card, potentially you will have multiple targets for that, and so there's likely, unless your opponent doesn't play unit, you should have a play that turn. Same with units that you can just slam on the board. So for example, a turn 3 play like Fighters for Freedom, which is just a solid 3-cost, doesn't have any on play effects, so it's really just a safe tempo drop to play on any given turn. So it's up to you to make the decision of if you think you need the flexibility. If your opponent's deck, I might need the removal, but I might also need to play a unit, or you can decide to commit to an option that covers most of your bases, and so you're able to keep that card for the following turn, that other card for the following turn. It is risky to keep that flexibility for yourself and not guarantee yourself of a card next turn. Now, in this example that I've talked about, you would still have a 3-cost card to play in the following turn. So that's another thing to weigh, right? Is am I okay playing this 3-cost card, right? This can be offset a little bit sometimes by leaders with 1-cost abilities to fill in this resource cap, etc. Our final risk that we'll talk about real quick is, should I resource this card that is an answer to a card my opponent might have? So Waylay is a great example of this. Waylay is a card that returns a non-leader unit to its owner's hand, and it's really great for dealing with upgrade-heavy strategies like that weak leader play that we mentioned in the last tip. This is again a scenario where you're going to need to evaluate the board state, evaluate the deck your opponent's playing. If you see your opponent and you know that their deck likely has a play that is gonna involve a heavily upgraded non-leader unit, then you should maybe consider keeping Waylay, even if it means resourcing a different card, so you have the answer for that. But if your opponent is not very upgrade focused, then you're much more okay resourcing Waylay and losing that. But either way, it's going to be a bit of a risk, but it's one you'll learn to manage as you learn the matchups in this game. On to tip number 3. Tip number 3 is know when to stop, which means like knowing when to stop resourcing. So for players that are new to the game, that are still learning, something that a few new players sometimes miss is that you always have the option to not resource after that first initial turn. So you can just at any point not resource and just draw those 2 cards and keep them and go from there. So it's an important aspect of the game is knowing when to quit resourcing, so you can just take advantage of drawing the 2 cards each turn. A good rule of thumb is that you always want to resource until you can deploy your leader. Your leader is one of the most important parts of your deck, especially the turn that they deploy. They come in when ready. They usually have a really strong ability, right? And they can change the tide of the board into your favor. So you always want to resource at minimum until you can deploy your leader and use that deploy side, that epic action, to turn the tide in your favor. Now, where it gets tricky is when you ask the question, should I be resourcing past my leader's deploy cost or in the late game? So this is going to depend heavily on the cost of cards in your deck. So an example with this, we'll use Luke Skywalker as an example, who deploys at 6. If your deck caps out at 6, like the 6 is your most expensive card, then you have incentive to potentially stop at 6, since you're not going to need to play a card that's more expensive than that. Similarly, if your deck goes up to 8 resources, right? So for example, say you've got Redemption, which is an 8-cost blue hero card, and you've got Luke, then even if you don't have Redemption in hand, it's ideal for you to go up to at least 7 resources. So if you draw Redemption, you're able to resource and then be at 8 for that turn. You can also just resource in the late game if you draw cards that are just useless and that are not going to affect the battlefield or help you in any way. A good example of this is Resupply. Resupply is a great tool to kind of ramp, get more resources to work with. But in the late game, it's really not having much of an impact on the board, and you usually have enough resources to play the cards you need to win the game. So it's totally fine to just resource or resupply. Another thing to consider when thinking about how high you want to resource is you want to look at the potential of playing multiple cards. So I just talked about how if your deck caps at a 6, maybe you don't want to go above 6. However, if your hand is showing you, okay, I've got this good 4-cost card, I've got this good 3-cost card, and I like to play these cards together, then you do need to go up to the 7 resources to make sure that play is possible. I'll say as a general rule, going about 1 or 2 above your leader's deploy cost, heavily dependent again on the most expensive cards in your deck and how many resources you need to play those cards. It's a good thing to keep in mind when playing. Our second best tip for resourcing is evaluate the game. I can't really stress this enough, how important it is to just take a moment, look at the board state, look at everything. So first thing you should do is you should consider your opponent's board state. You should look at how many cards they have in hand, how many resources they're at, what's on their board, what's in their space arena, has their leader been deployed, etc., what's in their discard pile, and evaluate if you're going to need specific cards. This is especially important for removal cards. Do I have a target for this removal? And it's also important to keep in mind the potential cards that your opponent could have and play this round. So if your opponent is playing Command Villainy or Green-Black, and they likely have Overwhelming Barrage in their deck, which is a really strong card that could wipe the board. So you need to look at their board state and figure out if Overwhelming Barrage is going to stop you. How does that affect what you're going to be playing this turn, and does that affect the resource that you put down? The initiative token is another very major factor when you're making this decision. Some cards, especially things like removal cards like Takedown, as an example, are much better when you have the initiative because you're able to remove an opponent's unit before it's attacked. However, if you're not able to do this, your opponent's basically guaranteed to attack with the unit that you want. Maybe you'll consider keeping a unit instead that you can play afterwards, since you're not going to be able to prevent the damage anyways. If it's not a absolute must-kill unit, you might be better off building up your own board rather than removing your opponent's, just as one example. So always consider the initiative and how you can use that to your advantage when deciding what to keep and what to resource. Finally, our number one tip, the most important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about resourcing, when you think about playing the game, is how you start, starting each match. So with that first hand of 6 cards, you kind of want to look at it and plan out your first couple of turns. That's whether that's the first 2 turns, first 3 turns, depending on the hand, right? Have an idea of what do I have to play this turn 1? What do I have to play this turn 2? Do I have flexibility on either of these turns? Like, do I have 2 cards I can play on the first turn, 2 different cards? Do I have 2 cards I can play on the second turn? And give yourself options, and then think about how you can resource to maximize the flexibility of that opening hand. It's very important to not hold on to expensive cards too early in the game, especially at the start. As an example, you might have a really strong card like the Darth Vader legendary unit in your opening hand, but that card costs 7, and so that card is most likely not going to be deployed on the battlefield for 4 to 5 turns, depending on it, like if you ramp or not. And so you even though it's a strong card, you definitely need to resource it at the start of the game so you can give yourself the flexibility of those cheaper cards to take control of the board and take control of the game. Another super important aspect of this is going first versus going second. Your plays can vary differently depending on if you've got that initiative token or if you don't. An example of this is in a Sabine Mirror. The Sabine red unit, which is a 2/3 that deals 1 damage to either the defender or the base, is able to trade with itself. The player with the initiative can choose to deal the 1 damage to the defender, meaning the player that going first, their Sabine will live and the opponent's Sabine will die. So Sabine is a lot better as an opening card going first versus going second. So you got to think about that, especially if you're in the mirror, any of these trade situations where your card can trade with your opponents and live. When going second, you want to consider potentially keeping 2 cards that you can play on the first turn, because you get to play a little bit more reactively. So for an aggro decks, great strategy if the cards in your hand allow it is to keep a ground opening unit and a space opening unit. And then after you see where your opponent plays their opening unit, then you play to the opposite arena, so you get guaranteed damage and you can push to win the game. This opening phase of the game is super important because this is when you have the most control over your resources. You get to look at a total of 6 cards and resource 2 of them, and you also have this option to take that mulligan. So it's important to use this to your advantage and set yourself up for success for the rest of the match. Resourcing in Star Wars Unlimited is a fundamental part of the game, and learning to resource well will give you a competitive edge over your opponents. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked our content, please be sure to subscribe. You can follow this YouTube channel for more content like this, updates, guides, news, and of course our podcast, which is available every Monday morning. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you in the next one.